Recently, I revisited 2013's DmC Devil May Cry, a game that I don't personally hold as an example of great video game storytelling, but which nevertheless contains moments of true narrative brilliance that have stayed with me for a long time. And I found that, even now, returning to this game after almost a decade since I last played it, and having a completely different outlook on the medium of games and the craft of storytelling as a whole, I still think that there is value in analyzing the ways in which DmC both fails and succeeds at telling its story. When I think about true innovation in terms of video game storytelling, I often think about indie games pushing the boundaries of what is even possible to do within the medium of games as works of narrative. I very rarely, however, think about AAA games in this same way, with their almost monolithic sense of narrative style and the same set of gameplay conventions being reused over and over. In a way, DmC was no different than any other soulless AAA game in this regard. The truth is that, even back when I first played it, I never really expected this game to tell a meaningful story, nor did I really want it to. In fact, what I expected out of DmC was what I expect from most AAA games, a story that would be either barely serviceable at best or just very badly written at worst. But that was fine because what I really wanted out of this game was simply to have a cool, flashy gameplay experience and then move on. I mean, I still go back to replay old Devil May Cry and Bayonetta games even to this day because they are really fun to play, not because they tell great stories. And yet, DmC has stood out to me over the years because it has a more unique, more interesting relationship with its story than what you usually find in AAA games. And while I think that it ultimately fails to create a compelling, well-crafted story overall, I also believe that DmC displays some of the most creative instances of narrative work that I've ever experienced in any AAA game. And by the way, I want to clarify that throughout this video I will be using the term AAA game in a very loose manner, mostly to refer to games that are envisioned and developed as commercial projects by mid to large-sized publishers and which have at least a noticeable amount of resources, both in terms of their budget and development teams, to significantly impact their development process. Specifically, the part about games as commercial projects is a very important aspect of this definition as it applies to this case, since DmC was meant to be both a reboot and a continuation of a pretty big video game franchise owned by a well-established developer/publisher, even if it was Ninja Theory and not Capcom themselves who worked on it. As such, I think it's fair to argue that DmC was, in fact, a high-profile game. And so, in this video, I want to analyze the narrative elements of DmC, diving into the many aspects that comprise its story, from the plot and characters to the narrative structure and style of the game, breaking down the ways in which it fails as well as the ways in which it succeeds. But more importantly, what I want to do in this video above all else is to just share what I consider to be some truly brilliant and creative moments of video game storytelling and to talk about why they have stayed with me for so long.
There you are.
Here I am.
This isn't good. It's the walls. Get out of here!
At the time of its release, DmC was a controversial game for various reasons, most of them having to do with the ways in which DmC reimagined the identity of previous entries in the Devil May Cry franchise. some of these objections to the game were very silly, such as people being upset about Dante's quote-unquote emo redesign, while others had perhaps more validity to them. Hardcore Devil May Cry players, for example, felt that DmC dumbed down the gameplay formula of the franchise too much, which I can kind of see now. I still think that the gameplay of DmC is super engaging and deep as a whole, and yet by the end of my playthrough I couldn't help but notice that even at my level of skill, I was beginning to find very easy ways to cheese SSS rankings pretty consistently, which in turn made the game a bit tedious and repetitive at times. Either way, DmC's departure from earlier titles was intentional. 5 years after the release of Devil May Cry 4, Capcom decided to hand the franchise to Ninja Theory because they wanted to redesign and reboot Devil May Cry in the hopes of boosting the sales of the series. And after running a quick Google search, it seems to me that despite the aforementioned initial backlash, the reception of the game was generally positive after release. Both the gameplay and the story of DmC were well received by critics, with the art style in particular garnering high praises. As for my personal experience with the game, I remember liking DmC a lot when I played it back in 2013, and even now I consider it to be an enjoyable experience overall. That being said, if we are considering the narrative side of the game, two things immediately stand out to me about DmC. The first one is the tone of the game. DmC tries really hard at times to have a grittier, edgier aesthetic than its predecessors did, sometimes to its own detriment. And the second thing is simply the fact that DmC seems more interested in telling a compelling story than earlier entries in the franchise were, which never really tried to put a lot of thought behind their stories. And while I don't doubt that many people might have found the story of DmC to be compelling 10 years ago, myself included, if we analyze the game today through the lens of the craft of storytelling in the traditional sense of the word, I just don't see how you'd be able to argue that the story of DmC is ultimately successful. I think that, at best, DmC is a mixed bag, narratively speaking. There are some really interesting elements in there, but overall, the game fails to capitalize on its potential and is ultimately unable to bring everything together into a cohesive, well-crafted story. The premise of the game is interesting enough. The demon Mundus, who appeared as the antagonist in the first Devil May Cry title, is reimagined as the evil CEO of a big corporation who is trying to control humanity through things like debt, fear-mongering, and some kind of soft drink capable of brainwashing humans. On the other side, we have Dante, a half-demon who joins an underground group of revolutionaries fighting to take down Mundus and free society from his clutches. And so, DmC takes the bland concept of evil demons that was present in previous games and attempts to use it to explore grander and more politically aware themes such as capitalism, free will, and control, among others. Like I said, this in itself is an interesting premise. The problem is that the main elements of the game's story themselves begin to fall apart if you look at them too closely. Things like plot or character development, all of the central elements that comprise the story of DmC are underdeveloped in that very particular way that we have come to expect from AAA games because, ultimately, the story of the game is only secondary to its gameplay, as opposed to having one inform the other so as to create a greater work that encompasses both of these two sides. And, honestly, I don't even think that the story of DmC is that bad, really, at least by AAA standards. The plot of the game is serviceable. It's built in that very practical way that video game stories are put together so that you have enough reasons to go explore cool locations and collect items or fight bosses. But while the turns of the story are compelling enough to keep you interested in the events of the game, DmC ultimately fails to collect all of its elements into a meaningful, overall narrative that is more than just a collection of really cool video game levels. That being said, The main problem with the game's story lies not with the plot but with the main cast of characters themselves, who are not interesting enough to drive either the narrative or the emotional arcs of the story. Dante, Virgil, Cat, and Mundus are the main figures present in the game, along with a few other secondary characters, but at best, most of these are nothing but one-note characters, and at worst, they completely lack any kind of character to begin with. Take Dante, for example, who, as the protagonist, is one of the most interesting characters of the game. Dante is an aimless, cocky kind of guy who is as good at trash talking as he is at shooting demons. You think that these qualities would make for an interesting protagonist, but most of the time he just comes off as a generic video game hero just because the game requires him to be. And while this might have been enough for the lighter tone of earlier entries in the franchise, it's not enough for the more serious emphasis that DmC tries to take towards its story. The thing that I find puzzling about DmC, though, is that when I really think about it, I can see that all of the elements that you need to have a good story with good character arcs are already there. Dante begins as an immature, rebel without a cause kind of person who has no purpose in life, nothing of meaning to give reason to his existence. After he joins Cat and Virgil, however, Dante gains what he always lacked: a family and a purpose, a reason that is worth fighting for. And later, we even get to see his convictions change and mature through some of the events of the game, such as his meeting with Phineas or the growing tension between him and Virgil. And so, as the story of the game unfolds, we see Dante grow as a character. Or at least, we should. Similarly, we can see Cat grow as well. In the beginning of the story, Cat is defined by her unflinching, uncritical loyalty to Virgil because it was Virgil who rescued her from an abusive household. But once Dante joins the group, Cat begins to realize that Virgil is abusive in his own way too, and that she doesn't need to be loyal to someone who doesn't reciprocate that loyalty. And so, in the end, she is able to break free from the cycle of abuse that she still finds herself caught in, or, at the very least, her understanding of loyalty becomes more complex. Like I said, all of the elements for a good story are already there, but when you take the game as a whole, it never quite manages to build an organic narrative arc that makes me connect with these characters emotionally. And so, both Dante and Cat, as well as the other characters in the game, feel blank to me. A big reason for this is that, ultimately, the structure of DmC wasn't designed to have a good story. It was designed to be a good Devil May Cry game. Because of this, the story struggles to really take off, relegated as it is to cutscenes that take place in between levels, and the characters are forced to act in ways that fall along their previous iterations in past Devil May Cry games. For example, I think that by far the most interesting aspect of the story is the relationship between Virgil and Cat, as well as the one between Virgil and Dante. As the game progresses, there is a sense of mounting tension between Virgil and the other characters, where before they were a unified group with a clear enemy, Mundus, they slowly become more and more detached from each other, leading up to a point when Virgil finally turns on Cat and Dante. This is your classic friends become enemies kind of trope, but within the context of DmC's narrative, this doesn't even make sense. For one, Virgil and Dante barely know each other, so they don't really have a lot of history between them, certainly none that we experience directly during the course of the game. And while the game tries to set up these two characters as foils for one another, no narrative work is actually done to drive this point. Just as Dante simply decides to be the good guy at times, Virgil simply decides to be the bad guy. Similarly, we don't know much about Virgil and Cat's relationship either, other than what these characters let us know through brief moments of exposition. In fact, most of the time, the only thing we see throughout the game is that Virgil doesn't really care about Cat at all. So when Virgil finally turns on his friends at the end of the story, it doesn't really feel like a big emotional payoff. It just feels like he's doing so for no other reason than the fact that this is a Devil May Cry game, and Virgil is always a villain in Devil May Cry games. And something similar happens with Mundus as well, who serves as the main antagonist of the game. I said earlier that DmC takes the concept of evil demons present in earlier Devil May Cry games and then uses it to explore larger, more interesting themes. But that's not quite true. Despite the fact that DmC brings in grand themes such as capitalism, corruption, and free will, it feels as though the game then doesn't know what to do with those themes, so it just decides to ignore them altogether. Even though Mundus says in an early cutscene that he controls the world through depth, I wouldn't really be able to tell you what Mundus actually represents within the context of the story, if anything at all. Both Mundus and Virgil, who serve as the villains of the story, fail to create any kind of tension that builds up towards some kind of meaningful resolution at the end. This is what I mean when I say that if we look at the story of DmC through the lens of traditional storytelling conventions, we can only come to the conclusion that, for all its potential, the game's story is inherently flawed and fails as a cohesive work of fiction. The characters feel blank, the themes of the story feel underdeveloped, and the plot, while serviceable, doesn't build towards a coherent ending that resolves the emotional tension present in the story. And yet, as I've tried to argue, it's not like it's all bad either. The game does have its moments. I like, for example, how the game sets up Dante's story in a way that alludes to the traditional hero's journey in ways that are genuinely interesting. I also like some narrative elements in the game and what they do for its story. The character of Barbas, for example, as well as that of Phineas. And I like several of the sequences in the game, such as the police raid on the Order's headquarters, the evil soda factory, or the level where Dante infiltrates Mundus's tower, among others. The problem, however, is that DmC fails to create a cohesive story that is greater than the individual elements that comprise it. So, how is it that a game with such an interesting premise can fail so badly in its execution? I mean, when I look at the story of DmC, it really feels as though it should be good. The game has a villain who is an evil demon, but also represents the evil of capitalism. As Dante raids the surreal levels of the game and slays hordes of demons, the game also explores the ways in which Mundus controls people through consumerism, symbolized by the whole evil soda subplot, as well as by employing fear-mongering and manipulating information, represented by the character of Barbas. And on the other side, you have a band of revolutionaries fighting oppression, each of them growing as a character in their own way, even as a rift between them begins to drive them apart from each other. Like I said before, all of the elements for a successful story are already in there. In fact, I think that it is precisely this potential that already lies within the game, that which gives me the sense that the story of DmC is, if not great, then at least enjoyable. But in the end, the game's story never manages to coalesce into anything more meaningful than that. And I'd argue that, ultimately, a big part of the reason as to why this may be the case has to do with the fact that DmC was always meant to be a AAA game above anything else. If we stop trying to figure out whether the story of DmC is good or bad, and we instead look at how DmC tells its story, and more specifically, how DmC tells its story as a video game, we can begin to see the ways in which the conventions of the AAA gaming industry constrain and hold back DmC's narrative potential. From its inception, the medium of video games has employed storytelling elements to drive gameplay, much like other types of games do in general, such as card games like Magic the Gathering or tabletop games that can often vary in complexity and scope. But traditionally, story in games usually serves the purely practical purpose of providing a premise so that the gameplay can take place. And while games can excel at creating emergent story arcs through their use of gameplay mechanics, they are not particularly a well-suited medium for more traditional storytelling elements. Video games are no different in this regard, as game developers have struggled to bridge the gap between gameplay and narrative from the very beginning, trying to find ways to incorporate storytelling elements into their games in a way that feels organic. But because telling a story is not the main priority of most games, storytelling in video games can often be very basic, or it can feel very forced and unnatural, falling into the same old and tired conventions that have been done a million times already and which have no real interest in creating a compelling work of narrative, but are instead there just for practical purposes, such as using text to do the bulk of the narration, or having non-interactive cutscenes in between gameplay segments, or employing very simple and repetitive dialogue structures, or even doing the bulk of the storytelling through lore entries found in menus, etc. This is all to say that, strangely enough, video games have always occupied a weird space between toys and works of narrative, between entertainment products and works of creative art. And nowhere is this duality more obvious than within the AAA gaming industry itself. The fact of the matter is that AAA games in particular have always tried to ride this line between gameplay and narrative very carefully, if not very successfully. Being the huge commercial projects that they are, AAA games want a dazzling gameplay loop featuring flashy new gameplay mechanics, but at the same time, they also try to be very narrative oriented so as to appeal to a larger, more casual or mainstream audience. As such, these games tend to be very interested in storytelling, but only in the most conventional way possible, and so they employ storytelling elements in a more traditional manner, either because they're just falling into the expected conventions of the medium, or because they are trying to emulate other forms of media with a bigger, more mainstream appeal, such as movies. Case in point, if you look at any given trailer for any given AAA game, you'll notice that game trailers often look like movie trailers more than anything else. Storytelling is what big game developers use to sell their games, even when those games themselves may not actually be that interested in crafting a compelling story. But because games are not movies, and they also need to have all the, gameplay, AAA developers end up with the paradoxical question of, how do you make your game also be a movie? Or, put another way, how do you juggle gameplay and story in order to create a narrative-driven experience that is both a good game, but also appeals to a wider audience? Well, the AAA gaming industry has arrived at a very simple and very inelegant answer to this question, which is that you just make a game and then you squeeze a movie into your game. In other words, you just make a bunch of cutscenes where the story takes place and then you shove them in between the game's levels. In this sense, DmC's structure follows the conventions of the AAA gaming industry very closely by breaking up its story into exposition-heavy cutscenes that take place in between gameplay segments. This very uninspired approach to telling a story not only constricts the game's narrative potential, but it's also just plain boring. But, like I said before, DmC needed to be first and foremost a good Devil May Cry game. Generally speaking, this way of telling a story by breaking a game into gameplay levels followed by story cutscenes has become the default for AAA games attempting to create a narrative-driven gaming experience. And this is also a big part of why I've become very disenchanted by the AAA gaming industry as a whole. This kind of storytelling has always been, to me, one of the most bland ways to do a video game story because it fails to take advantage of the unique medium in which it exists to do anything even remotely interesting. Every time I play a AAA game, I seem to get the sense that the story and the gameplay are always at odds with each other rather than working together to create a larger artistic work of narrative that combines all of its elements organically and meaningfully. And I feel like this is the case for DmC as well, since, sure enough, it is precisely when DmC puts away its more traditional storytelling elements, such as dialogue-heavy cutscenes, and instead leans into the unique strengths of its medium, that the true moments of narrative brilliance in the game can happen.
Prepare the gateway. You'll have to go alone this time. Cat can't follow where you're headed.
Alone is fine. She's done enough.
On the plus side, there won't be any cameras down there.
Good.
Dante, we don't know much about this demon.
I'm sure it'll be lovely.
Well, Bob, now I get why your point of view is so upside down.
The thing about stories in general is that they are comprised of more than just their very visible surface parts, such as plot and dialogue. Stories are also made up of deeper elements like tone, structure, pacing, motifs, language, symbolism, or themes. Things that might not be as readily apparent right away, but which nevertheless affect the overall identity of a story. And if we're talking about the medium of video games specifically, then we can add even more things into the mix, such as level and enemy design, game mechanics, environmental storytelling, and the overall way in which the player interacts with the world and the many other elements of the game. All of these affect the overall narrative of a game too, whether directly or indirectly. Now, DmC was ultimately a AAA game whose main purpose was to be as conventional as possible in terms of its narrative structure in order to sell as many copies as it could. And if this was any other game, I'd say, sure, this can just be a fun game where the story's only purpose is to provide a setting for the gameplay to happen. But the thing about DmC is that although its story is ultimately not successful, there are moments that truly shine in there, moments that are worth dissecting and analyzing, but as I just mentioned, these moments can only happen when DmC is willing to let go of traditional methods of storytelling in order to embrace the unique potential that the medium of video games affords it. And that's what I want to discuss now. DmC's story revolves around Dante, who, after meeting with his long-lost twin brother Virgil, joins an organization called The Order. Led by Virgil, the Order is made up of an underground group of revolutionaries trying to bring down the demon Mundus. While this premise is certainly interesting, DmC does nothing with it. In fact, the only things we know about the Order are the things that Virgil tells us during lengthy cutscenes. We don't really know anything about the Order, what they do or why, or who the people that comprise the organization even are. We also never really understand the threat that Mundus represents to humanity, at least not in concrete terms, and so we can never understand the role and purpose of the Order either. All we get is a vague depiction of an evil villain doing evil villain things. In other words, DmC fails to set up the stakes of the story compellingly enough, and along with that, the game fails to lay out the purpose of the Order in relation to the central villain of the story, as well as the dynamic within the ranks of the organization that Dante has just joined. We never even see anybody other than the three main characters at any given time, at least until a level later in the game where the police raids the Order's headquarters and starts killing everybody in there, which could have been an interesting sequence if not for the fact that we've never even seen any of these people at all in the game before they all start dying during this one level. But I'll discuss this particular sequence later in the video. For now, it's enough to say that for all intents and purposes, the Order is really made up of only Virgil and Kat, which makes the organization itself and its role in the story feel irrelevant and weirdly invisible within the context of the story. However, if we look at the gameplay side of things, then there are many sequences in the game that I find truly fascinating in how they are able to carry the narrative of the game in ways that are actually interesting. After a very early and very long cutscene in which Virgil tells Dante about his past, the two brothers are spotted by one of Mundus's spies. Dante is dragged into Limbo, a parallel reality that exists on top of our own, and he is forced to fight his way through the city as he is being chased by demons. But here's the thing. One of DmC's most compelling elements lies in how the game plays with the architecture of the levels as the player moves through them. In any given level of the game, the very topography of the world changes around the player. The level itself shatters, stretches, twists, breaks down, and is rearranged into new shapes as words appear on the walls, floors, and ceilings. For a game that was released in 2013, DmC's levels are a visual spectacle that is mesmerizing even by today's standards. But the reason I like them so much is because of the way in which the game's levels drive the narrative of the game much more deftly than any of its many cutscenes ever could. Like I said, Dante has become part of a band of revolutionaries fighting to topple a corrupt regime. Playing through DmC's levels gives you the sense that you are moving through a world where everything is out to get you. The people have been brainwashed by Mundus and are always looking for you, but even more interestingly, the very architecture of the world is out to get you too, to entrap you, to prevent you from escaping. At one point during these sequences, Kat tells Dante that, quote, "the city itself is trying to stop you," even as he tries to squeeze through alleys that keep shifting around him in an effort to swallow him up. This is the reality that the Order faces in their attempts to take down Mundus, whose control has corrupted the very city to its core to the point that the city itself turns against them. There is no safe place for Dante to hide in, not when the very floor and walls around him can suddenly decide to bury him alive. In this way, the narrative of the game is carried by the symbolism that the levels themselves are able to craft organically and unobtrusively as the player simply moves through the game. DmC's brilliant level design underlines the narrative of the game and its central themes in a smart and compelling way. And while this type of storytelling through level design alone is not enough to address the flaws of the overall story, it does a much better job at driving the narrative than the writing in the game's cutscenes does. And what I love the most about this approach to telling a story is that it happens in a way that is very particular to video games, as you wouldn't really be able to replicate the feeling that a player gets while navigating the ever-shifting levels of DmC in any other kind of medium, at least not in the same way. There are many sequences like this one throughout the game. In an early level, for example, Virgil takes Dante to the house that they both shared with their parents when they were boys, a part of his life that Dante has forgotten. And as Dante pieces together what really happened to his family in the past, learning that Mundus himself was behind the death of his mother, the very architecture of the level, that is, of Dante's childhood home itself, is broken up, twisted, deconstructed, and rearranged into something new, mirroring the psychological process that Dante himself is going through. Once again, the inherent symbolism of the level carries the underlying narrative beautifully. And then there is also the level where the police raids the headquarters of the Order that I mentioned earlier. During this sequence, Dante is trapped in Limbo, and so he is unable to help Kat and the other members of the Order from where he is. The only thing Dante can do is watch helplessly as people die around him. Like I said before, this sequence fails to convey an emotional payoff because we don't even know who all the people being killed here are. But what this level does succeed in doing is portraying Dante as a powerless onlooker, which very smartly undermines the way in which he has been depicted throughout the whole game. Up to this point, Dante has been nothing but a cocky badass who is able to brute force his way through every problem. And yet, for all of his power, he is completely helpless in protecting Kat from a different kind of demon, the police, during this one sequence. And it is genuinely interesting seeing Dante under this new light. Moments like this, where the narrative unfolds mainly through the many elements that comprise the game, and which take advantage of the interactivity inherent to the medium of games as a whole, do a much better job at conveying and exploring both the overall themes of the story as well as the moment-to-moment narrative beats of the game, and they do so without a forced reliance on more traditional storytelling elements such as dialogue or exposition. As such, I'd argue that the thing that holds back DmC's story the most is the belief that the only way to tell a compelling story in a game is by having lengthy cutscenes do the bulk of the narrative work. But then again, exploring more creative approaches to storytelling might not have been a possibility in a AAA project such as this one. And lastly, I want to look at one more level. The one level that is probably the most famous and praised part of the whole game. The boss fight against Bob Barbas, or more specifically, the level that leads up to him in general. Besides evil soft drinks capable of brainwashing humans, Mundus also controls people through Bob Barbas, a newscaster who is a clear allusion to alt-right public figures along the lines of Tucker Carlson, or perhaps more accurate to the game's time of release, someone like Rush Limbaugh. Bob Barbas manipulates people by controlling information, twisting the truth or otherwise completely inventing it, and by deploying fear-mongering to drive his manufactured narratives. And in one level of the game, Dante is given the task of taking him down as a way to get closer to Mundus. The level in question begins with Virgil and Kat laying out Dante's objective: to infiltrate the TV station where Bob Barbas is and eliminate him. The trick is that Dante's goal is to get not into the TV station that exists in the human world, but into its inverted reflection, which exists only in Limbo, this inverted version of the station being the real one. As Dante plunges into Limbo, the world itself twists around, the cityscape, with all of its lights, suddenly blotting out the place where the sky should be, and below it, only an endless void. This is a truly amazing level to play through. Visually, it is stunning. It's so cool to navigate this upside-down world just in general, but like the other examples I mentioned before, this level does a lot of smart narrative work just on the basis of its design. The inverted tower is a symbol for the way in which this alt-right TV personality of a character inverts the truth. In fact, the whole upside-down city itself represents the state of the world under Mundus. But there's more to it than that. See, when I think about the work that someone like Tucker Carlson does, or any other personality similar to him, I think about the way in which these alt-right mouthpieces stretch the truth, how they invert it, twist it, deconstruct and reassemble it until it's unrecognizable, a distorted shape that barely resembles what it once was, much like Bob Barbas himself does. And what's truly fascinating about this one level, as well as many of the other levels in DmC, is that this is exactly the same process that we see play out in the very architecture of the level as we move through it. The very world is being twisted and rearranged into something else right under your feet. It is being deconstructed and reassembled into something designed to trap you. The level design itself drives the themes that are embodied by the figure of Bob Barbas himself. And though it sounds kind of cheesy and on the nose when said aloud like this, when you're actually playing through the game, this symbolism unfolds organically because most of it happens in the background while your mind is occupied by the more immediate concern of having to deal with the waves of demons trying to kill you. In fact, what I love about these examples of narrative brilliance is that they can only happen in those quiet moments that take place in between fights, as you traverse the world, stopping occasionally to take in the visual spectacle of them, if only for an instant. As for the fight against Bob Barbas himself, I don't think it's very good in terms of gameplay, but narratively speaking, I love that Bob is just this digital face that seems to have merged with the station itself, which is kind of how I imagine someone like Tucker Carlson, just a disembodied, leering visage that has become nothing but an allusion to a human face, inseparable from the abstract concept of the TV station itself and what it represents. But there is another moment that also sticks out to me during this same level. A moment when the inverted image of the world seems to carry with itself a different, but still loaded kind of symbolism. During his trek to reach the inverted station, Dante meets Phineas, a demon who helps him get to the tower. Dante is wary of Phineas at first because he is a demon, but after mutually helping each other out, Phineas tells Dante that he shouldn't rashly judge him just because he is a demon, and then he lectures him on the importance of being able to distinguish reality from illusion, showing Dante that there is another way of, quote-unquote, seeing things around him. Then, not long after, Phineas reveals to Dante that Mundus's only true weakness lies in his concubine Lilith, or more precisely, in the child that she carries. The only way to get to Mundus, Phineas tells Dante, is by killing Lilith and the child to lure Mundus out of his tower. Now, despite the fact that we've done nothing but kill demons throughout the whole game, there is definitely something ominous about Phineas's words. We are meant to understand that killing Lilith and her child, even if they are demons, would be crossing a line, but it's a line that Dante might need to cross. And, in fact, this plan rings especially ominous because it wasn't that long ago that Phineas himself reprimanded Dante for thinking that he was evil just because he is a demon. Thus, it is at this point that the central, overarching concepts of the game themselves are beginning to get twisted, deconstructed, and recontextualized as well. If not all demons are inherently evil by mere virtue of being demons, does that mean that killing Lilith and her child would be going too far to stop Mundus? As Dante considers the things that he might need to do if he really wants to go through with his obsession of getting revenge on Mundus, the camera begins to slowly rotate vertically until it is at an upside down position, leaving Dante as inverted as the world around him, as inverted as the very tower that he is trying to bring down. And this striking image is what I think of when I think about the story of this game. It's moments like these ones that have stayed with me long after I first played through this game. It's moments like these ones that speak of the untapped potential that lies within DmC's design as a whole. I think that maybe in a different timeline, the developers of DmC would have had the creative freedom required to fully explore the very unique and very creative approach to storytelling that we see sometimes surface throughout the game, instead of having to just chuck out a conventional AAA action game with nothing interesting to offer. In fact, it's interesting to consider DmC along the game that Ninja Theory released right afterwards, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, which is a game that is as far as you could possibly get from a title like DmC in terms of vision and scope, not to mention budget. Hellblade is a game that straddles the line between indie and AAA, existing in that nebulous AA space of game development. And yet Hellblade manages to tell a compelling story that uses both traditional, non-interactive methods of storytelling, such as cutscenes, while also employing gameplay systems in creative ways that underline and support its narrative. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that Hellblade is one of the best examples of a narrative-driven game in the traditional sense that I've ever experienced. In terms of its overall craft, Hellblade is far superior to DmC in every possible way, with the exception that its gameplay is not as complex and fleshed out as that of DmC, but even that is by design, as a complex gameplay loop would only detract from the underlying themes of mental illness that the game tries to center. And so I can't help but wonder as to how the experience of working on DmC might have affected the development of Hellblade as a whole. Did Ninja Theory learn something while working on DmC and then applied it to Hellblade? Or was Hellblade able to come into existence precisely because it was not constrained by the added limitations that come with a AAA project, such as the commercial expectation to sell, in a way that DmC might have been? All I can say is that the AAA gaming industry, in their ultimate goal of selling games, has adopted an uninspired and artless way to go about crafting stories in video games. Despite the fact that AAA games are obsessed with creating narrative-driven experiences, the main way they go about it is by trying to employ traditional methods of storytelling so as to emulate other kinds of media that have a more mainstream appeal. And yet this doesn't need to be the case. There are other, smarter ways to go about crafting narrative-driven games that can be as flashy and appealing as any movie out there. And that's why I ultimately think that there is value in analyzing the relationship that DmC has with its story. If we try to engage with DmC as a work of storytelling, in the traditional sense of the word, then there's not much to say about it other than it ultimately fails in crafting a cohesive story, which is what I've come to expect out of many uninspired AAA titles. From a flawed and hollow story with underdeveloped themes and characters, to weird shifts in tone that occur when the game tries to take itself too seriously, not to mention depictions of women that fall into the same tired and sexist tropes that you'd expect out of a game like this one, and a bland narrative structure which breaks its story into cutscenes that are separate from the gameplay. DmC is a game that fails as a work of storytelling. And yet, what I find so fascinating about this game is that if we look at DmC's compelling use of twisting architecture to drive the overall narrative and its underlying elements, we'll find that there is something of value to learn here. That when you are willing to lean into the unique strengths that the medium of games affords you, instead of trying to forcibly rely on more traditional methods of storytelling just because it's expected of you, you can craft a narrative-driven experience that's just as complex, flashy, and interesting as any of the biggest AAA games that are out there, while also being a compelling work of storytelling that has something meaningful to say. Even before I decided to revisit DmC for the purpose of this video, this was a game that, in one way or another, always stayed with me. But when I thought about DmC, I didn't think about its bland characters or plot. No, what always stuck with me about this game was the surreal imagery created by its levels. What I always remembered about it were the sequences where the city is collapsing, stretching, twisting around you as you try to fight your way through. What I remember about it was looking up at the inverted cityscape surrounding Bob Barbas' tower, watching as the rain fell upwards along the sides of buildings while the lights of the upside-down city shone in the background. In the end, DmC is not a game that I'll ever associate with great video game storytelling. And yet within the surreal, twisting architecture of this game, there lie some moments of true narrative brilliance that will stay with me for a long time, and which nevertheless remind me of the enormous potential that exists within the medium of games to tell unique and memorable stories.